She had buried 3 people killed by motorcycles, and she was standing in the most notorious Hells Angels hangout in the state. But what this stranger didn't know, what nobody knew yet, not even Margaret herself, was that in less than 2 years, she'd be wearing a Hells Angels family patch, riding her own Harley-Davidson across the desert, and living the one dream her dead family never got to complete. This is the story of how Margaret went from a suicidal alcoholic widow who hated motorcycles with every fiber of her being to becoming one of the most respected riders in the Phoenix Hells Angels community. How she took the very thing that destroyed her family and transformed it into her salvation. If you've ever thought it was too late to start over, if you've ever been told you're too old, too broken, too damaged to rebuild your life, Margaret Foster's story will prove that not only is it possible, it's your duty to the ones you lost. And the journey to get there, it's going to shock you. Before we dive into this story, if you believe it's never too late for a second chance, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every Wednesday, real people over 50 who had the courage to start over when everyone said it was impossible. Your story might be next. Now let me take you back to 1975, when everything began. Phoenix, Arizona, 1975. Margaret Ann Mitchell had just turned 24 when she met James "Jimmy" Foster at an Eagles concert at the Veterans Memorial Coliseum. He had shoulder-length hair, a worn black leather jacket, and a cherry-red 1974 Harley-Davidson Sportster that gleamed under the parking lot lights. Margaret, daughter of a conservative accountant and a piano teacher, had never been on a motorcycle in her life. But when Jimmy offered her a ride, she didn't think twice. They married in 1976, at the height of the disco era. But their wedding had nothing to do with the flashing lights of Studio 54. Jimmy worked as a mechanic in Camelback East Village, fixing Harleys during the day and building his own on weekends. Margaret worked as a secretary at Arizona Public Service Company, typing letters on an IBM Selectric while listening to Hotel California on the office AM radio. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Their daughter, Sarah Michelle, was born in 1978, the same year Grease was filling movie theaters. Margaret remembers nursing the baby while watching Maj on their black and white TV, and Jimmy rocking Sarah to sleep quietly singing Kansas's Dust in the Wind. Sarah grew up hearing Harley engines rumbling in the garage, sitting on the tank of her father's bike, with the engine off, of course, and drawing winged skulls in her school notebooks. Jimmy never officially joined the Hells Angels. He respected the club too much to think himself worthy, but he loved that culture, that brotherhood, that symbol of absolute freedom on 2 wheels. Every Sunday morning, the family had breakfast at the Denny's on Thomas Road, and Jimmy would point at motorcyclists roaring past the window, teaching Sarah the difference between a Harley Softail and a Road King by the sound of the engine. The 1980s arrived with neon colors and exaggerated shoulder pads. Margaret let her hair down and bought a denim jacket with silver studs. Sarah entered her teens listening to Bon Jovi and glued to the pink rotary phone she got for her birthday. MTV was starting to change the music world, but in the Foster household it was good old classic rock playing on the car's cassette deck. Led Zeppelin, Creedence, The Who. In 1996, Sarah met Marcus at a motorcycle rally in Scottsdale. He was 28, rode a chrome Harley Fat Boy, and had the same gleam in his eye as his grandfather when talking about bikes. Jimmy approved immediately. "This kid understands what freedom on 2 wheels means," he told Margaret that night, lighting his Marlboro on the porch. Sarah and Marcus married in 1997. In 1999, their grandson was born, James Marcus, JJ to the family, named after his grandfather. Margaret was 48 and the happiest grandmother in Phoenix. Jimmy, now 51 with streaks of grey hair, built a miniature wooden Harley for his grandson. "When he turns 16, I'll teach him to ride properly," he promised. Life was simple, Margaret continued working, now as an administrative manager. Sunday dinners at their house, with Sarah bringing JJ wrapped in blankets, Marcus and Jimmy talking about carburetors and engine displacement, Margaret and Sarah laughing in the kitchen while preparing the roast. That was it. It was enough. It was everything. Until it wasn't anymore. August 17th, 2014, Sunday, 2:47 p.m. Margaret was at Safeway buying ingredients for dinner when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something, intuition, destiny, who knows, made her press the green button. Mrs. Foster, this is Officer Martinez from the Phoenix Police Department. You need to come to St. Joseph Hospital immediately. There's been an accident. The next few hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant, and words that made no sense. Head-on collision. Drunk driver. Lane invasion. We did everything we could. Sarah Michelle Foster, 36 years old. James Marcus, J.J. Foster Jr., 15 years old. Pronounced dead at 3:22 p.m. and 3:31 p.m., respectively. Mother and son, daughter and grandson. Ripped from Margaret's life in less than an hour. Marcus survived. He fractured his collarbone, 3 ribs, and his spirit. 2 weeks later, he left Phoenix without saying where he was going. Margaret didn't blame him. How could he look at her, at Jimmy, without seeing Sarah and JJ? Jimmy started dying that day, not physically, not yet. But something inside him went out. He stopped working on motorcycles. His Harley sat in the garage covered by a grey tarp. He watched TV without seeing anything, ate without tasting, existed without living. On February 6, 2016, Margaret woke up to find Jimmy lying beside her, cold. Massive heart attack, the doctors said. But Margaret knew the truth. Jimmy died of a broken heart. She was 65 years old and alone. The first year was basic survival. Margaret would wake up, go to work when she could manage it, come home and stare at empty walls. The house smelled of mold and loneliness. Jimmy's clothes were still in the closet. Sarah's old room, now used only for storage boxes, was just as she'd left it on her last visit. Bon Jovi poster on the wall, teddy bear on the bed. It was in the second year that alcohol entered the picture. It started with a glass of wine at dinner, then 2, then a bottle, then vodka because it was faster and didn't smell as strong. Margaret retired early, citing health problems. The truth was, she could no longer pretend she was okay. Friends called. She didn't answer. The neighborhood church sent baskets. She left them at the door. Her younger brother Robert came from Tucson once a month, knocked on the door, begged her to open it. Most times she pretended not to be home. Days became weeks, became months. Margaret would wake at 11 a.m., drink until 3 p.m., nap on the couch, drink again until she passed out around 10 p.m. Repeat. The house was chaos. Dishes piled in the sink, unpaid bills, uncut hair, dirty nails. She was 67 years old and weighed 106 pounds. She'd lost over 45 pounds since the accident. On the night of September 14th, 2019, the eve of what would have been JJ's 20th birthday, Margaret was in bed with a half-empty bottle of cheap vodka, staring at the cracked ceiling, and for the first time since the accident she thought, I can't take one more day. It wasn't a dramatic thought. It was just a fact, a realization. She was done. There was nothing left to live for. But then, and she could never really explain why, she remembered something that made her angry, so angry she wanted to scream. She remembered the police report, the accident report she'd read 1,000 times, looking for answers that didn't exist. Motorcycles are death machines, the investigating officer had written in his notes. These accidents are always the same: speed, recklessness, showing off. And suddenly, Margaret was furious. Because that wasn't Jimmy. That wasn't Sarah, that wasn't Marcus. They weren't reckless, they weren't showing off. They were killed by a drunk driver who crossed into their lane. But society, the police, everyone, they all blamed the motorcycles, they blamed the victims, and Margaret realized she'd been doing the same thing. For 5 years, she'd hated motorcycles, hated everything Jimmy loved, as if the bike itself was responsible, as if Sarah's passion for riding had killed her. But it wasn't the motorcycle that killed them. It was a drunk driver in a pickup truck, the Red Devil Bar. Jimmy used to pass by there when picking up parts from the auto shop on Van Buren Street. "One day we have to grab a beer there," he'd always say. "It's a Hell's Angels meeting point, you know. Real people, not these weekend warriors." Margaret didn't know why that memory came. Didn't know why. At 10 a.m. on September 15th, she showered for the first time in 4 days, put on the only clean pair of jeans she had, grabbed the keys to her dusty Honda Civic — Jimmy's Harley had been sold years ago, she needed the money — and drove to the Red Devil Bar. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, Harley-Davidsons of every model, Softails, Road Kings, Street Glides, Fat Boys, gleaming under the scorching Arizona sun. Margaret parked the Civic at the back of the lot, as if ashamed of her small, silent car among these steel and chrome beasts. She sat there for 10 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, air conditioning no longer working, sweat running down her temples. What was she doing there? She didn't even drink beer, for God's sake, just vodka, and only at home, alone. But then the bar door opened, and she walked in. It was dark, smelled of beer and old leather, and the jukebox was playing Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild, a song Jimmy loved. The bartender, a bald man in his 50s with tattoos covering his arms, looked at Margaret with an expression that clearly said, "You're lost, ma'am." "Vodka tonic," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "We only serve beer and whiskey," he replied. "Then whiskey. Neat." She took the first sip and almost spit it out. It wasn't the watered-down vodka she was used to. It was liquid fire, good. Margaret stood at the bar alone for maybe 15 minutes. She could feel eyes on her, whispers. A frail, elderly woman in a biker bar. She knew how she looked. Wrong. Then the door burst open, and a group of bikers walked in, laughing, leather vests marked with the unmistakable Hell's Angels patches, the death head, the 81 Phoenix underneath. One of them, a man in his 60s with a long grey beard and a scar running from eyebrow to cheek, stopped when he saw Margaret. He walked straight to her. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. Not unkind, but direct. "No," Margaret said. "Then why are you here?" And Margaret, without thinking, without being able to stop herself, said, "My husband died. My daughter died. My grandson died. All in motorcycle accidents. And I came here because this was the last place my husband wanted to bring me before he died. And I don't know why I'm here. But I needed to be somewhere that wasn't drowning in their absence." The man studied her face for a long moment. Then he turned to the bartender. "Tom, get this lady another drink. On the house." He turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry for your losses. But I gotta ask you something, and don't take offense. If motorcycles killed your family, why the hell would you come to a biker bar?" And that's when another voice cut through from the back corner. A younger biker, maybe 40, with a sneer on his face. "She probably thinks we're all murderers. Thinks bikes are death machines. Right, lady? That what you think?" The bar went quiet. Margaret felt her face flush. She felt rage bubbling up, but also something else. Shame. Because yes, for 5 years, that's exactly what she'd thought. She started. The older man with the scar, she'd later learn his name was Jack Mad Dog Henderson, president of the Phoenix Hell's Angels Charter, held up his hand to silence the younger biker. "Show some respect," he said quietly. Then to Margaret, "Ma'am, you don't owe us any explanation. But if you want to talk, I'm listening." And so Margaret told them everything. About Jimmy, about Sarah and JJ, about the drunk driver, About 5 years of darkness. About how she'd blame motorcycles when it wasn't their fault. About how she'd betrayed everything Jimmy loved because she was too broken to see clearly. When she finished, Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your husband loved bikes. Your daughter loved bikes. They died because of some asshole who couldn't stay sober behind the wheel. But you spent 5 years punishing the thing they loved most. That sit right with you?" Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. "No," she whispered. "No, it doesn't." "Then maybe," Jack said slowly, "it's time you stopped running from what they loved and started honoring it instead." Over the following months, Margaret returned to the Red Devil every week. Not to drink, she'd surprisingly stopped drinking at home. Going to the bar had become a ritual, almost sacred. She'd arrive at 3 p.m. on Saturdays, order a whiskey, which she now knew how to appreciate, and sit in the corner, just observing. She watched the bikers coming and going, watched the camaraderie, the strong hugs, the genuine laughter. She watched a woman she'd seen on her first day, who she now knew was named Susan Wildcat Rodriguez, a 62-year-old former nurse who joined the club after divorcing at 58. "You want to ride?" Susan asked one day in December 2019. "What?" Margaret said, confused. "On a motorcycle. You want to ride?" I don't know. It's been so long. I haven't been on a bike since Jimmy died. I swore I never would again." "Come on." Susan wouldn't take no for an answer. Susan's bike was a 2018 Softail Deluxe, painted metallic purple with silver flames. Margaret put on the helmet Susan gave her, climbed on the back holding Susan's waist, and when Susan accelerated and they left the parking lot, Margaret cried. Cried for the wind on her face, for the roar of the engine, for the feeling of being alive for the first time in 5 years, for the memory of being on the back of Jimmy's bike in 1975, young and scared and happy, for the memory of Sarah at 8 years old screaming, "Faster, Daddy," while Jimmy took her around the block. When they returned, Margaret couldn't stop laughing and crying at the same time. "Again," she begged. "Please, again." In January 2020, Jack called Margaret for a private conversation. "You want to learn to ride?" he asked. "I'm 68 years old," Margaret said, "and I don't know if I can. What if something happens? What if I crash? What if—" "What if you don't?" Jack interrupted. "What if you learn to ride and discover that your husband, your daughter, your grandson, they were right all along? What if the thing you've been running from is exactly what you need?" Learning to ride at 68 isn't for the weak. Margaret fell, a lot. She scraped her knees, hurt her wrists, got bruises that took weeks to disappear, muscles she didn't know she had ached after each training session. But every time she got on that bike, a Sportster 883 the club had found for her to practice on, she felt Jimmy beside her, felt Sarah cheering excitedly, felt JJ saying, "That's it, Grandma, you got this." It took 6 months of training, but in July 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, with the whole world shut down but the desert still free, Margaret Foster passed her test and received her motorcycle license. She was 69 years old. Jack and the club organized a small ceremony. "This isn't how it normally works," Jack explained. "To be an official HAMC member, there's a whole process. You start as a hang-around, spend years proving your worth, become a prospect, and only then, if unanimously approved, you get the patch. But," he paused, "you're not here to be a regular member. You're here because you lost everything and found us. And because your husband respected us. That means something." Margaret didn't become an official Hells Angels member. That would be impossible. The club's rules are strict. But she became what they call family. She got a leather vest with a special patch that said 81 Family and Phoenix. It wasn't the complete death head, but it meant she was respected, protected, accepted. And most importantly, she bought her first motorcycle. A 2015 Harley-Davidson Heritage Softail Classic Red, the same color as Jimmy's first bike. She sold the house in Glendale, too big, too many ghosts, and bought a small apartment near Tempe. With the money left over, she customized the Harley. On the sides of the tank, she had two small images painted, a rose for Sarah and a star for JJ. And in small but bold letters, "Riding for those who can't." The first long trip was in September 2021. A group of 10 club riders, including Margaret and Susan, took the route to Sedona, passing through Flagstaff, camping under the stars, sleeping in cheap motels, eating at roadside diners. Margaret was 70 years old and felt 25 again. At the campfire on the second night, Jack told old club stories. Susan talked about her divorce and how the motorcycle saved her. Another member, a Vietnam veteran named Carlos, talked about PTSD and how the road was the only thing that calmed his mind. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she said, "5 years ago I wanted to die. Thought my life was over when Sarah and JJ left. When Jimmy died, I spent 2 years too drunk to feel anything. I thought I'd never feel anything but pain again." She paused, looking at the flames. "But you showed me that pain and love aren't opposites. They're the same thing. I love Sarah, Jimmy, and JJ so deeply that their absence hurts. But that doesn't mean I have to stop living. It means I have to live for them. Carry the love they had for bikes, for freedom, for life. Carry that with me." There wasn't a dry eye around the fire that night. In 2023, Margaret met Frank Bones Thompson at a rally in Laughlin, Nevada. He was 72, had been a member of the Los Angeles Hells Angels charter for over 40 years, and had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. They started talking about pain, about loss, about finding purpose after everything falls apart. They didn't fall in love like young people fall in love, with fire and intensity. It was more like recognition. "Oh, you also survived hell? Let's survive together." Frank started visiting Margaret in Phoenix once a month, then twice. Then he simply never left. They didn't get married. "What for?" Margaret would say, laughing, but they became partners, riding partners, life partners. Today, in 2025, Margaret Ann Foster is 74 years old. She rides a 2023 Harley-Davidson Street Glide, bought with her own money, thank you very much, and has traveled over 50,000 miles since she started. She's been to Sturgis, South Dakota, the mecca of motorcyclists. She rode the Pacific Coast Highway in California. She crossed the Grand Canyon at sunrise, tears streaming behind her sunglasses, thinking about how Sarah would have loved that view. Everywhere she goes, she takes a photo of the bike with the "Riding for Those Who Can't" plate visible and posts it to the Facebook group she created, Never Too Late Riders, a group for motorcyclists over 60 who started late. The group now has over 15,000 members worldwide. Margaret completely stopped drinking in 2020 and never went back. She does therapy every week with a psychologist specializing in grief. She reconnected with her brother Robert, who now rides a Harley at 68, inspired by his sister. She even found Marcus, her former son-in-law, in 2024. He'd moved to Oregon, remarried, but never forgot Sarah and JJ. When he saw Margaret's motorcycle, he cried and said, "Sarah would be so proud." In a recent interview with the Arizona Republic, Margaret said something that sums it all up. "People think starting over means forgetting, but it doesn't. Starting over means honoring. I didn't forget Sarah, JJ, or Jimmy. I honor them every day I get on that bike. Every mile I ride, they're with me, in the wind, in the roar of the engine, in the feeling of freedom Jimmy loved so much." She continued, "A lot of people ask me, how did you have the courage to start at 68? And I always answer, what choice did I have? Die in a bottle, die of loneliness, die of pain." The truth is, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something is more important than fear. For me, honoring my family was more important than my fear of living without them. Margaret and Frank are planning a trip through Alaska in the summer of 2025, something she never imagined she'd do. She still lives in Tempe, but now the house doesn't smell like mold anymore. It smells like leather, motor oil, and fresh coffee. On the living room wall, she has 3 photos, one of Jimmy on his first Harley, one of Sarah and JJ on their last trip together, and one of Margaret today on her street glide, helmet in hand, smile on her face. She visits the cemetery once a month, always on her motorcycle, and always says the same thing. "Hey family, brought you along for a ride." Margaret's story proves something fundamental. Your second act can be your best act, not because it erases the first, not because it makes you forget the pain, but because it transforms pain into purpose. It takes the worst thing that ever happened to you and says, "This won't define me. This won't destroy me. I'm going to use this to rebuild myself into something new." At 68, Margaret didn't know who she was without Jimmy, without Sarah, without JJ. Today, at 74, she knows exactly who she is. She's a survivor, a motorcyclist, a free woman, and she's living proof that it's never, ever too late. Margaret's story proves that your second act can be your best act. If this story touched you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every Wednesday we tell stories like this, real stories of real people who started over when everyone said it was too late. And here's the most important part. If you're over 50 and living a dream you thought was impossible, or if you're about to take that first scary step, tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And who knows, your story might be the next one we tell the world, because that's what this channel is about. It's not about motorcycles. It's not about radical hobbies. It's about a simple and powerful truth. It's never too late. Your second chapter is waiting. The only question is, do you have the courage to start writing it? Until next Wednesday. And remember, keep your wheels on the road and your eyes on the horizon, because life, like the best road, isn't about the destination. It's about the journey.